Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Cade and I'm joined by my friend Andrew. And for this episode, we're going to be talking about our top five favorite horror movies of all time. All right, so Andrew, for my number five, I think that would have to go to Psycho from 1960. Before I really talk about why I love this movie, where does it sit with you as a film?
This is going to sound incredible, but I have never actually seen it.
What? Really?
No, I have never actually seen Psycho. I know that's almost heresy in our field, but still.
All right. Well, okay, I understand. But yeah, I got to tell you, Psycho, it's definitely unique in the way, I guess it could be related to the slasher genre, but I think that what's unique about it is it's distinctive. It's different than most of the other slasher films. It's not set out in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't have a slasher who is silent and who just kills for the sake of killing. I think what's nice about it is, well, one thing I like about it is the story changes halfway through the movie. It switches protagonists. At first, we follow Marion Crane, but then we start focusing on her sister Lila and Sam, and it changes genres. Halfway through, it changes genres. It starts off as this sort of drama, but when you get halfway through, it sort of evolves into a horror slash thriller film. And I think that that's really unique about it. And I also love how, again, it's a movie that shifts genres, and sometimes that's something that can work, or sometimes it probably won't work as well. But I think this is definitely a movie where it succeeds in that. But other than that, one thing that I think does deserve a lot of recognition would have to be the character of Norman Bates, which again, he's a distinctive horror icon. He doesn't really feel like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or Leatherface. He's a horror icon who's obviously not silent, and he also has, I think, personality. And I also do like the idea of him having two different personalities at the same time. I like how his regular personality is him as this calm and kind individual, but then when you see the mother side, he's this ruthless, evil, and cunning individual. And I think it's definitely a fun horror icon to follow because I think it could be argued that, while he could be seen as the villain of the film, I think it could be argued that he could be seen as the protagonist as well because of how the movie shifts who we're following. So that's definitely a unique approach for Norman as a character. I would actually rank him up there with Michael and Jason and Freddy, actually. But other than that, I think what does deserve recognition is also the main location of this film, the Bates Motel. That is such a iconic horror location, and it just works really well because it's nice to see this large, beautiful house resting next to this little motel. And it just seems like such a peaceful area that you wouldn't expect something like that to happen. So yeah, I think that the Bates Motel is definitely one of the best horror locations, and I definitely loved how it was explored again in the Bates Motel TV show. So yeah, Psycho as a horror film is definitely one of the best ever made, and yeah, it's definitely up there with my top five. So yeah, that's why I put it here. Oh yeah, but why don't we get on to your number five? Which one would that be?
Coming in at number five for me, we have Alien from 1979, directed by Ridley Scott. And my main reasons for loving this movie, number one, got to start with the lady herself, Ellen Ripley.
Yes.
One of the best protagonists in horror and sci-fi history. She's presented as just an every woman who's resourceful and level-headed, even in times of immense panic and chaos. And the movie emphasizes that by her being the only survivor because she's the only one who's able to keep focused and keep her calm, even when, there's immense panic going on and, reason and good reason to, because that ties into number two. The creativity of the xenomorph alien. Now, from what I understand, the painter H.R. Geiger was actually the gentleman who came up with the design for the xenomorph. And if you know anything about Geiger's paintings, you know the guy really likes, shall we say, phallic imagery combined with machinery and biological material. And you definitely see that a lot in the actual design of the xenomorph, from the very elongated head and just some very instantly iconic features like the double mouth for the head grab or the face hugger of the juvenile and the fact that it has to burst out of your chest. There's just a lot of creativity that went into it. And I think that's why it became such an instantly iconic and scary alien. Plus the fact, it's presented as a almost unbeatable killing machine. Another thing I really like that doesn't really get mentioned too much is the fact that this movie has not one but two great twists in it. Number one being the fact that the Nostromo was basically sent on a suicide mission to collect the xenomorph, or if against their, without their knowing, and the fact that Ash was in on it the whole time and was actually pulling the strings in the background to make sure it happened. Because, oh yeah, he's also a cyborg; he's not even human, so he's just following his programming. And another thing I really like is the cramped nature of this movie. There's not a lot of scenes in this movie that take place in big, wide open spaces. And because of that, everything's very cramped, everything's very tight. It never really gives the crew a chance to breathe, and thus it never really gives the audience a chance to breathe.
Yeah, it also makes you feel like you're trapped in the movie as well.
Yeah, the best thing I can compare it to is like the third act of Jaws, where they're just on the orca. There's nowhere to really escape because there's just this, and there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide. So yeah, just a very genuinely scary, genuinely tense, really good sci-fi movie. And if I'm being honest, it would probably crack my top 10 favorite movies, period.
Yeah, of course. But yeah, why don't we move on to our number fours? Number four on my list is Get Out by Jordan Peele from 2017. So when it comes to Get Out, we already did a review for this movie, obviously, but one of the things that I mentioned was how I love the plot for this movie. I think the plot for this movie is original, it's unique, and some levels of it are actually kind of believable in a sense. And I think, all that mixed together, I feel like that's something we don't typically see in a lot of, if not most, horror movies these days.
Yeah, no, that's something interesting and something fresh, which is why I think Get Out had the success that it did.
Yeah, exactly. And I love how it's not just a full on horror movie. I think it's also a mystery, it's a thriller, it's a comedy as well, which I will be honest, I don't typically watch horror movies looking for comedy, but with this, the comedy actually lands pretty well because it feels fresh and natural. And a lot of the comedy comes from the character of Rod and also Chris as well. Comedy is utilized very well, and I applaud Jordan Peele for that because he does it very well while also keeping the horror element alive and fresh in the same way. But other than that, I will say that what's nice about it is it's a horror film that doesn't rely so heavily on jump scares. And I think that that's something that kind of plagues a lot of horror films because, it's not a jump scare every 3 minutes or something. It's just a horror film that has a great atmosphere and great tension. And if you can build suspense with that, it makes the film feel unsettling without having to force jump scares down our throats every 5 seconds. So that's definitely another thing that I applaud Jordan Peele with in that sense. But other than that, I will just say, there are a lot of things about this movie that I love. I love the plot. I love the performances. I think the characters are distinctive. I love the elements that it explores. And also, it's a great debut film for Jordan Peele as a director.
Yeah, and like I mentioned in our review, I will never get over the fact that he went from Key and Peele to Oscar-winning horror film.
Yeah, and I will say this: when I first heard about the movie, when I saw the trailers, I did kind of think, I don't really know. And because of that, I didn't go see it in the theater. One of the biggest mistakes of my life. When I finally got around to watching it, I was blown away. And I got to tell you, it's definitely one of my favorite horror films of all time. And yeah, there's a chance it might be top 10 favorite movies of all time for me because of the creativity behind it. But yeah, aside from that, yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite horror films of all time. But what about you? What's your number four?
Coming in at number four for me, we have another movie that we have covered, weirdly enough, in the four position. We have Scream from 1996.
Ah, yes.
We have Wes Craven's other horror classic. Now, a lot of things I love about this movie, a lot of things I love about this movie that didn't really translate well into our review, if I'm being 100% honest. I love the two killer twist. I love how it kind of teases it. Billy is teased throughout the movie to be the killer, but there's like no teasing for Stu. So the fact that there's two of them, I thought was a great twist, and it's still a good twist. I love the meta tone of this movie. From Randy being this walking encyclopedia about how to survive a horror movie, how to recognize a horror movie, Sydney being a final girl and recognizing almost that she's a final girl, obviously not saying it out loud, but recognizing that she's kind of the main target in all this, and then actually thinking and using logic to not fall into all the classic pitfalls of being a final girl. And then there's all just kind of fun Easter eggs and references to other horror movies. Some of them are a little too on the nose, but that's not a terrible thing. Another thing I love, and this is something that's going to come up a lot in this list, I love the performances in this movie.
Yeah,
Because
of
like I
course.
just said, you got Sidney Prescott, still to this day is one of the best protagonists in horror history. Because again, she's smart, she's resourceful, and she knows how to handle herself.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to add to that, to me, the best protagonist, not just horror protagonist, but one of the things that I like about Sydney as a protagonist and as a character is she's not perfect. The best protagonists to follow are the ones who are flawed and who aren't perfect. Perfect heroes are not fun to follow. So that's nice.
Yeah, no, because it gives off this sheen of just plastic or unrelatability. Another thing is that this movie manages to have not one but two comedic relief characters who are both endearing and charming. That being Randy and Dewey. They're charming in different ways. Again, Randy is this big kind of big doofus, but he also is useful because again he recognizes that hey, we're kind of in a horror movie, and here's how we need to survive it. Dewey, same way. He's kind of he's wet behind the ears. He's kind of a dipshit, but he also still he's never like that never gets in the way and never gets other people hurt. Like he's still able to handle himself as a police officer. And then
Right.
you got Gail Weathers, who is this incredibly unlikable character who kind of learns over the course of the movie that yeah, if you go a little too far for your own agenda, you get other people and maybe yourself hurt in the process. So that kind of kicks off her character arc that we'd see throughout the rest of the franchise. And yeah, just some instantly iconic kills. Again, the whole opening sequence in this movie is phenomenal and actually works as its own little horror or mini movie on its own. And just a lot of nice little camera touches. Like I love the fact that when they're killing Drew Barrymore, they finally catch her and putting the knife in her chest. It's all slow motion to kind of emphasize it. Plus
Yeah.
the fact this movie features possibly one of my favorite kills in horror movie history, which is Tatum getting killed with the garage door or opener, just because it's like that is so damn creative. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. I get what you mean. All right. But yeah, why don't we move on to our number three? So, number three on my list is another film that we already reviewed. It is It from 2017. It's definitely one of my favorite horror films of all time. And one of the big reasons is because of the story. One of the big reasons why all five of these movies are my favorite horror films is because of the stories that they have to tell. And I love the story for this movie. I think, I like how a big part of it is about facing your fears, which does work really well in a horror film, but it's about a lot more than that. It's also about friendship and working together to help each other overcome their fears. So that's definitely, an element of the film that I always enjoy. And it's definitely one that gives the story, I think, a lot more depth in that way.
Yeah, and we're going back. It's a Stephen King story. There's always a big sense of heart at the center of it, especially when it's focused on kids like this one is.
Yeah. And I also love how, another thing that we were just talking about, how it's better when protagonists aren't perfect. And I love the Losers Club in that way because they're not perfect characters. They're all these flawed characters. And they're also very distinctive from each other. It's not seven kids with the same personalities. I like how, Bill is portrayed as more of the noble leader of the group, and Richie's the more wisecracking comedic guy. Him and Eddie, but Eddie, I think, is a lot more scared than most of them are. And you also have Beverly, who I think is more of the strong-willed character. Each of these characters are very distinctive, and that's what makes them fun to follow because it feels more engaging in that way.
No, I completely agree. And
Yeah, and another thing that really stands out is Bill Skarsgård's performance as Pennywise. Again, while Tim Curry's performance is still great, Bill Skarsgård really takes the cake in my opinion. I think that he just gives such an incredible performance, and he definitely, here's what's important when you have actors playing these types of characters. He brings presence on screen, and he brings a terrifying presence, and he also brings life to the character, and he makes the character feel alive, which is what you want out of a horror villain. But aside from that, and we covered this when we did our review, the setting for this movie is just so great, and it's something that I think works well with us as New Englanders. I love how it's set in Maine, and they do a great job capturing the beauty and horror of the setting, and it definitely works very well. And again, Stephen King's from Maine, so he obviously has a lot of his stories take place there. But I think this is definitely one of the standout stories that took place in Maine.
yeah, I mean, it's one of the most iconic King stories for a reason. And I think now it's become one of the more iconic King movies. It's definitely one of the better ones because there's some of them that are not so good.
Yeah, but a conversation for another time. All right, but why don't we get into your number three? What's yours?
Well, for number three for me, we are going back to 1991 for the first horror movie to win Best Picture. We are talking about The Silence of the Lambs. And I got three main reasons why I love this movie, and they're all because of the acting.
Yes.
Jodie Foster is Clarice Starling. perfectly encapsulates this very wet behind the ears, inexperienced FBI agent, but one who, kind of draws on her past to sort of put on the brave face and do what needs to be done in order to save the day. And you got Ted Levine as Buffalo Bill. This performance does not get nearly enough love as it should, in my opinion, because of just how damn creepy Buffalo Bill is in this movie. Because it's somebody you can clearly tell has completely lost their connection to reality, but somebody who's also smart enough to cover his tracks and get away with his horrible crimes for months, and also is also aware enough to toy with and tease his prey like a cat playing with a ball, or like a cat playing with a mouse who's already injured. It's kind of again, not enough love goes to Ted Levine for playing Buffalo Bill / Jamie Gunn. And then we come to the big reason I love this movie. Anthony Hopkins is a Hannibal Lecter. What else do I really need to say? This is not just one of the most iconic horror characters, not just one of the most iconic movie serial killers. We're talking about one of the most iconic movie characters, period, underline, because of just how perfectly Anthony Hopkins portrays it. He is portrayed as both this extra refined gentleman and a complete bloodthirsty monster, an intelligent doctor and an unhinged cannibal. And just the way Hopkins presents this very quiet and polite exterior just ups the creepiness, especially because by that point, the horrible crimes he's committed. And it's like, this character, this man did all of that. And just also the fact that the way he presents it is just, he's always 3 steps ahead of you. And just that cat and mouse dynamic between the ultra intelligent Lecter and the naive but headstrong hunk Starling is just this really perfect balance.
And one thing that I do like about Hannibal Lecter, and we've talked about this throughout this episode, but how characters are distinctive. One thing I do like is that he and Buffalo Bill are definitely distinctive. They don't feel like the same type of killer. So I think that that's definitely a good touch for the movie.
Yeah, no, Buffalo Bill is much more of like a John Wayne Gacy-esque serial killer, whereas Hannibal Lecter is kind of, it's not a great comparison, but a little bit more H.H. Holmes-like, a little bit more super intelligent, able to cover his tracks until he eventually doesn't. And one other thing is there's not just some great acting in this movie, there's some great writing in this movie.
Yes, for sure.
Like lines like, I ate his liver with a side of fava beans and a nice Chianti, and it puts the lotion on its skin. They're creepy and they were instantly iconic, and they're still very much in pop culture in the zeitgeist today. So just a very, I don't want to put this, it's a very well made, very well acted horror movie. It's a horror movie made for film connoisseurs.
Yeah, and it's not just a horror movie. It's also a mystery. It's a thriller, and that's nice.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even get into that because, again, we're trying to keep each one of these a little bit on the shorter side because otherwise I'm sure we could probably talk about these for hours.
Right.
Moving on to the top 2. What is Cade's second favorite horror movie?
Well, my top 2 would have to be A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. And, I have to acknowledge this because you also brought up Scream. It's by one of our favorite horror directors of all time, Wes Craven. And I think that, he's probably one of the main reasons why this movie is so iconic and so memorable and so great. His direction and imagination definitely benefit the film and make it the masterpiece that it is, in my opinion. And yeah, I think not just as a horror director, I think Wes Craven as a filmmaker in general is just a very visionary director and storyteller.
Yeah, I mean, that's why he had the, very successful, very long career that he did. And plus the fact that, nobody has a bad word to say about the guy.
Yeah, exactly. And when it comes to the story of this movie, again, that's a big part of how I rank these movies. I do love the story of this film because I think the concept is just so unique. Dreams versus reality, not knowing which is which, and how dreams, there's the chance that you could die in reality. And it's definitely a great concept. And again, it's a concept that just works really well with horror films because dreams are also a place where, us out of this movie in the real world, dreams are definitely, they can be terrifying for anyone.
Yeah. And again, there's a lot of creativity, and I love creativity.
Yes, creativity is definitely important. But aside from the creativity and Wes Craven's direction, I think something that needs to be brought up is definitely the 2 main characters of this film and their performances. First up, I have to bring up Nancy Thompson. She is definitely one of the best horror protagonists ever created, and I applaud Wes Craven and Heather Langenkamp for that. I think that Nancy is actually up there with Sydney and Laurie for the best horror protagonists ever created.
She's definitely in the mix.
Yeah, and again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. What's great about Nancy, and this is great for all protagonists in general. She's not perfect, she makes mistakes, she has her flaws, but she also has her advantages, and that's what helps her survive against Freddy throughout this movie. And it's what makes her more believable as a character.
Yeah, and again, it's a good horror protagonist is always believable.
Yes, exactly. And I definitely credit Heather Langenkamp with that because her performance is definitely great.
Yeah, I mean, she perfectly encompasses the girl next door who completely is in over her head, like has no idea what she stumbled into.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings me into what is probably the best thing about this movie, and that is just the character of Freddy Krueger, one of our favorite horror villains ever created. Freddy is just such a great icon. He has personality, he's terrifying. He actually has, a lot of horror villains, they usually just kill for the sake of killing. I think it's nice how Freddy has a motive, it's revenge against the people who killed him. And usually people say that it's scarier when there is no motive, and I understand that, but I do like how Freddy does because, again, it makes him distinctive, and that's important. But aside from that, can we just talk about Robert Englund's performance? Because, again, I don't think anyone could have played this role like he did.
Yeah, there's certain performances you go back and watch in movies, and you can just tell the actor was having the time of their lives playing it.
Exactly.
Yeah, Robert Englund is definitely having the time of his life playing Freddy. Probably doesn't like having to go through the makeup process all the time, but that's something else.
Yeah, and I think that that's why it's just hard for me to picture someone else in the role. No discredit to Jackie Earle Haley. I still thought he was fine, but Robert Englund is still definitely the only Freddy Krueger in my opinion. So yeah, that's definitely one of the reasons why this is my second horror film. And believe it or not, it's actually one of the first horror films that I ever watched when I was really young.
Yeah, because I mean, I understand it was rated R and it came out in the '80s, but compared to other horror movies, it's really not as gory as some of the other iconic horror movies.
Yeah, and aside from that, going back to the characters, what's nice? It's not, this relates to what we were talking about when we did our review for Scream. It's not a horror movie where you're just waiting around for each character to die. It's a movie where it has characters that you actually care about. So that's what's nice about it.
Yeah, and then when they die, it actually leaves some kind of emotional response.
Yeah, but yeah, why don't we get into your second favorite horror film of all time?
All right, for my number two, we actually have a lesser known, more known horror movie, more considered a cult classic than an outright classic, and that is ReAnimator from 1985, based on the H.P. Lovecraft short story of the same name. And one of my biggest reasons why I love this movie is our anti-hero and villain. Our anti-hero is played by Jeffrey Combs, Dr. Herbert West, and he's a completely insane but also brilliant med student who must frequently find his way to weasel and manipulate, hate his way out of trouble, and he does a very good job at playing both of those. And then for the villain, you've got Carl Hill, who is this incredibly brilliant and accomplished neuroscientist, but is a colossal creep on top of it. There's a dinner scene where he's macking on his boss's daughter who's engaged right in front of her father. That is a level of sociopathy that takes years to develop. And also the supporting cast I find quite fun as well. You got Bruce Abbott playing this very good-natured and bright-eyed med student who kind of gets corrupted a bit by Dr. Herbert West, and he's kind of this just massive himbo with no backbone. And then you got Barbara Crampton, who is this very sweet and level-headed love interest of Bruce Abbott's character, Dean. And she doesn't just fall into the usual love interest in a horror movie. She's got some personality. She's got some, she sticks out pretty well. And another thing I love about this movie, the effects in this movie are amazing. Like, in my opinion, right up there with The Fly, The Thing, and American Werewolf in London, because it is so well done and it still holds up to this day. And it's got an appropriate amount of gore for what the topic of this movie is, which is a mad scientist and his assistant trying to find the cure for death. But when they bring things back to life, they're not the same. Kind of like Pet Cemetery, weirdly enough, except replace mysticism with science. And then last thing I want to mention is that it's got a very B movie schlocky feel, but with a really tight, really good script and some genuinely really good campy fun on top of all of that. Like again, Jeffrey Combs just steals the movie as Herbert West. And on top of that, there's also some really good kills in this movie. There's a scene where a head gets crushed between a zombie's hands. There's a head, or there's an exploding head kill, and there's my personal favorite: a zombie gets tackled from behind and gets stabbed through the back to the front by a bone saw, and the effects are done phenomenal. So just a very good movie, very great adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story, which I understand that's kind of controversial on its own, but we'll save that topic for another time. But yeah, just a very enjoyable movie that I do not think gets talked about enough.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, now here we are. Why don't we get into our favorite horror movie of all time?
Drum roll, please.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So my number one on the list is The Conjuring. It was tough to pick this, but yeah, I think my favorite does go to The Conjuring. So again, it's because of the story. The story works really well because it's actually a very thorough and interesting ghost story. It's not complicated or anything like that. We deal with possession in a different way. It's a ghost story, it's explored very well. And it's actually a pretty simple plot. We need to figure out why this demon is haunting this family. We need to figure out how to free this family from it. And what's nice is, aside from being a ghost story, it actually has a lot of unique layers to it. It has possession, it has demonic forces, it has witchcraft, and it adds so many layers while still being a very simple plot, which is nice.
Yeah, very nice.
And I think another reason why this movie is so great would have to be because of James Wan's direction. James Wan is definitely one of my favorite horror directors of all time. Just like Wes Craven and Jordan Peele, he's a very visionary filmmaker. And this movie definitely has creativity. And that's something I applaud James with, because I think this might actually be his best film ever.
Ooh, that's saying something because he has made a lot of enjoyable movies.
Yeah, he's made Saw, he's made Furious 7, he's made The Conjuring 2 and Aquaman and Malignant. But yeah, I think that this might actually be his best film.
Yeah, and you can tell he's an incredibly talented director because when he stopped directing the Conjuring movies is when they got bad.
Yeah, but that's a conversation for another time. But aside from James's direction, I think another thing that's great would have to be the performances. Vera Farmiga, Patrick Wilson, and everyone else. The movie has protagonists that are distinctive and that you can root for. And that's what makes this the best horror movie for me, or my favorite at least. And this is what makes all of these movies my favorite horror films. The protagonists are people who you don't just sit around waiting for them to die. They're people that you're actually rooting for and who you actually want to see make it out of the movie alive. And that's something that I give a lot of credit to the actors for, because that helps you, it brings heart to the movie in that way.
Yeah, and the fact that they have great chemistry together too, you really can believe them as husband and wife too. So
Yeah, and it's actually a really unique dynamic between these two families. You have one family who's being haunted, the other who's the expert with everything that's going on, and you see them working together to stop this supernatural force. And it's definitely a unique dynamic in that way.
definitely. And another one, I thoroughly enjoy The Conjuring too. Again, it doesn't really crack my top five. I don't even know if it would crack my top 10, but I definitely did enjoy it.
Yeah, of course. And you know what else? One thing that I think is unique about this movie, it's a horror film where no one dies. Aside from most slasher films or other supernatural films, that we do see deaths in those movies quite a lot. But this is a movie where, if you think about it, aside from what happened in the past, throughout most of this movie, I don't think anyone actually dies. And that's actually unique because it remains unsettling and terrifying without any deaths.
Yeah, and again, it's not really a jump scare heavy movie either. It's got a couple of them in it, but they're all shot and set up very well too.
Yeah, and again, this is something I've brought up before, but it's a big part. A big part of that is the atmosphere. The atmosphere of this movie is just incredible, and this relates to the setting for the film, the main location at the house, which again, it's a location that is both scary and beautiful at the same time. Every time I look back at this movie, I'm definitely feel unsettled by the house, but at the same time, I'm just thinking, God, this house is beautiful. They're managing to capture the eeriness and beauty of this place so well, and that's just so unique about the film.
Yeah, because isn't that house it's based on actually still standing? Or am I thinking
Yes,
of
it is.
another horror franchise?
Yeah, I think it still is actually. Yeah.
Well, I wonder how many I wonder how many unwanted visitors the owners of that house get. Because I know the people that own the staircase from The Exorcist have to shoo people away all the time.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, definitely my favorite horror film of all time. I think there's a chance it probably always will be. But aside from that, why don't we get on to your favorite horror film of all time, which I know you've been wanting to talk about on the channel for a while. But did you want to talk about any honorable mentions first?
I do, and before I get into that, I will definitely say a worthy choice for number one for you, Cade. So I do have three honorable mentions because a bit of backstory. When I was making this list, I had a list of 16 movies I needed to boil down to five. So I decided, okay, I'll do five in my top five, and then I'll do three that really got close to cracking the top five. It didn't quite make it in the end because of one reason or another. My first honorable mention is An American Werewolf in London because it's got amazing effects, especially that first transformation scene, and the fact that it all still looks really good to this day and doesn't even look remotely robotic, and the fact that it's not a typical werewolf story. You know, there's
Right.
a little bit more of it like a dream and kind of morally ambiguous aspect to it. Number two is actually one of my mom's favorite movies, weirdly enough, The Lost Boys, the best vampire movie ever made, and I will die on that hill. It's got this really great 1980s vibe. It's got a killer soundtrack. It's got cool villains and campy heroes and some great acting by a very talented young cast.
Yeah, of course.
And then my third and final one, this one really got close. This would probably be six if we were taking this list out to 10. And that is The Thing by John Carpenter. A great suspense, a great sense of suspense that never lets you go. It's like got you by the throat the whole movie. The best effects in horror movie history. Again, hill I will die on a very fitting, ambiguous ending, great kills, and a great cast of characters. So there's my three honorable mentions. And now we get to the big boy. What is my number one favorite horror movie? We are going back to 1975. We are going back to the movie that started the summer blockbuster. We are going to Jaws by Steven Spielberg.
Yes.
Now, a bit of background about me. I'm a marine biologist. Kind of comes with the territory. But jokes aside, there is so much I love about this movie. This is, in my opinion, one of the few truly perfect movies ever made. And while I could talk about this movie for probably hours, let me talk about some of my favorite things. Start off with John Williams' iconic score.
Yes.
John Williams managed to make a little piano trill composed of two notes into an instantly iconic, foreboding theme of doom. And it has been parodied to death, but it is still super effective. Then you got the main trio, Brody, Quint, and Hooper. Everybody in that trio is perfectly cast. Roy Scheider bringing this kind of every man in who knows he's outmatched, but he knows he's got a big responsibility to the island people that he is sworn to protect. Hooper, played by Richard Dreyfuss, this kind of a little bit full of himself, a little, kind of cocky, ultra educated marine biologist, but somebody who is still also able to recognize danger and handle himself. And then you got my favorite character in the movie, Robert Shaw's Quint, this legendary, badass, ultra crusty fishing boat captain with more than a few similarities to Captain Ahab from Moby Dick, which also took place in New England, weirdly enough. But he portrays this, kind of working class as blue collar hero, but somebody who also has immense trauma in his past as to why he is as obsessive as he is. And somebody who also realizes that that obsession is getting other people hurt and he kind of snaps out of it, which just kind of makes his death all the more tragic at the end because he's the only member of the big trio that doesn't survive.
I think I have this question to ask now that we're talking about Jaws. Would you say that this is Steven Spielberg's best movie ever made?
Oh God, that's a hard one. Because I will admit I have not seen every single one of his movies, especially his more recent ones. I can't really give an answer to that because he's done so many different kinds of different great movies. Like Saving Private Ryan is a great war movie. Schindler's List is a great historical drama. Indiana Jones is a great adventure movie. This is a great horror thriller movie. It's a really hard question to answer. And then another thing I love, the kills in this movie. Oh my God, the kills in this movie. From that opening shark attack scene, which doesn't show the kill on camera, but it emphasizes how dangerous the shark is, to Alex Kittner being attacked, the shark's kind of off screen, kind of on screen for that one. But then there's just this big expanding pool of blood. It's the lesser is more policy in this movie. Show the shark as little as possible, and thus the shark becomes more terrifying for when it actually is on screen. Of course, that was actually done on purpose because apparently the animatronic shark, was a colossal pain in the ass on set and broke every 5 seconds. But it does a phenomenal job at establishing tension and not breaking it but again, not showing the shark. And also, just when the shark is on screen, it's shot very well. You know, you got Quint's iconic last stand, desperately kicking at the shark's nose, trying to keep out of its mouth, then eventually failing. And then you've actually got my favorite kill in the movie, which is neither of those. It's actually the guy in the rowboat. I just love the way it's shot. He's looking directly down at it. You can see the guy struggling to get back in the boat, and then you just see the shark or the shape of the shark come up from the deep and just bite him and grab him. This is a fun movie. It's a still scary movie. Perfectly acted. It's perfectly directed. It's got a great script that is a lot better than the book, because the book by Peter Benchley is kind of boring, if I'm being brutally honest. Spoiler alert, this is not just my favorite horror movie. This is my favorite movie of all time.
Yes, very true.
And we will cover it one day.
All right, guys, I think that's the end of this. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you later. Thanks. Bye.